You thought your disconnection was the problem, that it was the thing holding you back, the thing you needed to fix, the thing that proved something inside you was damaged. But what if that distance was the only reason you made it this far? What if disconnection wasn't where you failed? What if it was where you adapted? Because there were moments when staying fully connected would have been too much. Too much pressure, too much expectation, too much to process without breaking something inside you. And your nervous system knew that, long before you understood what was happening. It made a decision you weren't aware of, not to destroy your connection, but to reduce your exposure, to create space between you and the weight you were carrying. Not permanently, just enough to help you continue. At the time, it didn't feel like protection. It felt like loss. It felt like something in you had gone quiet, something that used to respond immediately, something that used to feel present without effort. But absence doesn't always mean damage. Sometimes absence is distance, and distance is how your system survives what it cannot fully absorb all at once. You didn't choose to become distant. Your system chose it for you. It chose stability over collapse, function over overwhelm, continuation over shutdown. And it worked. You kept going. You built a life. You carried responsibilities that required consistency. From the outside, nothing appeared broken, but internally you assumed something must be wrong because you no longer felt the same. You blamed yourself for the distance. You blamed yourself for the numbness. You blamed yourself for not being who you used to be, without realizing that who you used to be might not have survived what you went through. The version of you that feels disconnected now isn't evidence of your failure. It may be evidence of how your mind learned to protect you. When full connection became too expensive to maintain, you were never meant to carry everything at full emotional volume. But there came a point when you had no choice. Expectations didn't slow down. Responsibilities didn't pause. Life didn't ask whether you had the capacity to feel everything fully while living it. It only asked whether you could continue. So your system adjusted, not dramatically, strategically. It lowered the intensity of your emotional exposure. It softened the signals. It created distance between you and what might have overwhelmed you. Not because you were incapable, because you were still required to function. And functioning became the priority. You needed to show up. You needed to perform. You needed to maintain stability in environments that didn't make space for your internal state. So your nervous system did something intelligent. It reduced what you felt so you could continue doing what was necessary. At the time, you interpreted this as loss. You thought something inside you was fading, but fading wasn't the intention. Protection was. Because when emotional input exceeds capacity, the system doesn't choose collapse first. It chooses adaptation. It chooses efficiency. It chooses survival. Disconnection wasn't the destruction of your emotional world. It was the regulation of it. It was your system finding a way to keep you moving forward without forcing you to absorb more than you could safely carry. You didn't stop feeling because you were weak. You stopped feeling fully because your system was trying to make sure you didn't break under the weight of everything you were holding. This is where the conflict begins, because part of you understands that disconnection helped you survive, but another part of you still mourns what it cost. You miss the version of yourself that felt everything without hesitation, the version of yourself that didn't need to think about being present, the version of yourself that was naturally inside your own life. Before everything became something you had to manage, before every emotion became something you had to regulate, before every experience passed through a filter. You remember what it felt like to react instinctively, to laugh without analyzing it, to feel excited without questioning it, to exist without constantly observing yourself from a distance. And now, everything feels slightly delayed, not absent, delayed. Like there's a moment between the experience and your ability to feel it fully. You notice it in conversations. Someone says something meaningful. You respond appropriately, but internally, the emotional connection feels thinner than it used to. You notice it in your achievements. You reach a milestone. You recognize its importance, but the satisfaction fades quickly. You notice it in your quiet moments, moments that should feel peaceful, feel neutral instead, not painful, just neutral. And neutrality, when it replaces depth, can feel like loss. This is the paradox of protection. Protection keeps you safe, but safety often requires distance. Distance from intensity, distance from vulnerability, distance from anything that might destabilize your ability to continue functioning. Your nervous system didn't know which emotions were safe and which weren't. It didn't selectively mute only pain. It reduced everything: pain, joy, excitement, connection. Not equally, but enough. Enough to create stability, enough to create predictability, enough to prevent overwhelm, because overwhelm threatens continuity, and continuity was essential. You had responsibilities, you had expectations to meet, you had roles to maintain. There wasn't space to collapse, there wasn't space to fall apart, there wasn't space to stop and feel everything fully. So your system made a trade. It sacrificed depth to preserve function. It sacrificed intensity to preserve consistency. And at the time, it was the right decision, because you survived. You endured, you made it through environments that demanded resilience. But survival doesn't ask whether you feel fully alive. It asks whether you remain operational. And you remained operational. You became someone who could handle things, someone who could maintain composure, someone who could keep moving forward, even when parts of you were asking for pause, even when parts of you were asking for space, even when parts of you were asking to be felt. You learned to override those parts. Not consciously, automatically, because stopping didn't feel like an option. Stopping felt like risk of falling behind, risk of losing momentum, risk of becoming someone who couldn't keep up. So you didn't stop. You adapted. You became efficient at living without full emotional engagement, and efficiency became normal. This is why disconnection feels so confusing, because it helped you become stronger in ways that were visible. You became more independent, more self-contained, less reactive, less easily shaken. But internally, something felt quieter, not in a peaceful way, in a reduced way, and you didn't know how to explain it, because nothing was obviously wrong. Your life worked, you worked, everything continued, except your full sense of presence. And the hardest part is this: you began blaming yourself for the very adaptation that protected you. You called yourself numb, you called yourself distant, you called yourself broken. You assumed something inside you had deteriorated, without realizing that nothing had deteriorated. Something had adjusted, something had recalibrated, something had shifted in response to what you experienced. You weren't losing yourself, you were protecting yourself. But protection rarely feels like protection while it's happening. It feels like absence. It feels like distance. It feels like loss of something you didn't realize was fragile. You didn't know how much connection required safety. You didn't know how much openness required capacity. You didn't know how much presence required stability. So when stability became threatened, presence became negotiable. Not eliminated, negotiable. Your system kept just enough connection for you to continue, but not enough to expose you to overwhelm. This is the quiet intelligence of adaptation. It prioritizes survival over experience. It prioritizes continuity over depth. It prioritizes protection over aliveness. Not permanently, but as long as necessary. And the version of you that exists now, the version that feels distant sometimes, the version that feels like it's watching itself live, that version didn't emerge from weakness. It emerged from necessity. It emerged from learning how to exist in environments that required endurance. It emerged from learning how to carry weight without collapsing. It emerged from learning how to continue, even when continuing required becoming someone slightly less connected than before. And the conflict you feel now, the tension between understanding why it happened and wishing it hadn't, is not evidence that something is wrong with you. It's evidence that part of you is still there, still aware, still remembering what it felt like before protection became part of your identity. What makes this so difficult to accept is that disconnection worked. It did exactly what it was supposed to do. It allowed you to continue in environments that didn't slow down for your humanity. It allowed you to meet expectations even when your internal world was under pressure. It allowed you to maintain composure when reacting honestly might have created consequences you couldn't afford. Disconnection gave you control. Control over your reactions. Control over your exposure. Control over your ability to function regardless of what you were carrying inside. And control creates stability. Stability creates predictability. Predictability creates safety. Your nervous system values safety more than anything else. Not happiness, not fulfillment. Safety, because safety ensures survival. So when emotional exposure became unpredictable, your system reduced exposure, not because it wanted to take something away from you, because it wanted to protect your ability to continue. You didn't stop feeling entirely. You stopped feeling at full intensity. You stopped allowing emotions to interrupt your functionality. You stopped allowing vulnerability to interfere with your continuity, because continuity became essential. There were things you needed to maintain, responsibilities you couldn't abandon, expectations you couldn't ignore, roles you couldn't step away from. So your system learned how to keep those roles intact. even if it meant reducing your emotional presence inside them. This is why you could still care, but feel distant, still engage, but feel slightly removed, still exist inside your life, but feel like part of you wasn't fully accessible. You didn't lose access completely. You limited access, and limitation creates efficiency. Efficiency allows endurance. Endurance allows survival. Survival allows continuity. But continuity comes with a quiet cost. The cost of full immersion. Full immersion requires openness. Openness requires safety. And if safety feels uncertain, openness remains restricted. This restriction doesn't announce itself loudly. It integrates quietly. You become someone who doesn't react as strongly, someone who doesn't feel as deeply in the moment, someone who appears stable regardless of what's happening. From the outside, this looks like strength. From the inside, it feels like distance. You begin to notice that things that once moved you deeply now barely move you at all. Not because they stopped mattering, because your system stopped allowing full access to that level of intensity. It learned that intensity could destabilize you. And destabilization was something you couldn't afford. You needed to remain functional. You needed to remain reliable. You needed to remain capable of continuing no matter what you were carrying. So your system created distance as a form of preservation. Preservation of your ability to operate. Preservation of your identity as someone who could handle things. Preservation of your place in a world that doesn't pause for emotional processing. This is the hidden intelligence behind disconnection. It wasn't random. It wasn't weakness. It was regulation. Regulation of emotional exposure. Regulation of internal stimulation. Regulation of anything that might overwhelm your capacity to continue. Because overwhelm threatens stability, and stability was essential. You may not have noticed when this regulation became your baseline, because it happened gradually, one adaptation at a time, one moment of self-containment at a time, one decision to prioritize functionality over emotional engagement at a time, until emotional distance became normal, until limited access became familiar, until disconnection became part of how you operated. And the longer it remained, the more it felt permanent. You began to assume this was simply who you were now. Someone less emotional, someone less sensitive, someone less connected. But what if that assumption was incomplete? What if this distance wasn't a permanent loss, but a temporary configuration? What if your nervous system never intended for this protection to last forever? What if it only intended to protect you for as long as the threat remained? Because your nervous system doesn't erase connection. It preserves it. It places it behind protection, behind regulation, behind distance, not destroyed, stored, waiting for conditions where access feels safe again. This changes the meaning of disconnection entirely, because now disconnection isn't evidence that something inside you disappeared. It's evidence that something inside you was protected. Protected from overload. Protected from destabilization. Protected from experiences your system didn't believe you could fully absorb at the time. You didn't become disconnected because you were incapable of feeling deeply. You became disconnected because you were capable of adapting deeply. Your system didn't fail you. It preserved you. Even if preservation required creating a version of you who could survive without fully experiencing everything you carried along the way. And the distance you feel now may not be the end of your connection. It may be the space your nervous system created so you could make it here without breaking before you were ready to understand why. The moment this begins to change is the moment you stop seeing disconnection as damage and start seeing it as intelligence. Because weakness doesn't protect you. Weakness doesn't stabilize you. Weakness doesn't help you endure environments that demand more than you were ever meant to carry alone. Protection does. Adaptation does. Your nervous system didn't disconnect you because it was broken. It disconnected you because it was working exactly as it was designed to work. It recognized that something in your environment required more stability than full emotional openness could safely provide. So it created distance, not to erase you, to preserve you. You weren't becoming less. You were becoming protected. And protection doesn't always feel like safety. Sometimes, protection feels like absence. It feels like something inside you has gone quiet. It feels like you're watching your life instead of living inside it. But that quiet wasn't emptiness. It was containment. Containment of intensity. Containment of vulnerability. Containment of anything that might have overwhelmed your ability to continue. This is the realization most people never reach. Your disconnection wasn't the injury. It was the bandage. It was the structure that held you together when something inside you was under more pressure than it could fully process in real time. Without that structure, you might not have remained stable. Without that distance, you might not have been able to function at all. You didn't disconnect because you were fragile. You disconnected because you were adaptive, because your system prioritized your survival over your emotional immediacy. And survival is not weakness. Survival is intelligence under pressure. Everything you thought was evidence of something being wrong with you may have been evidence of something in you working to keep you intact. You weren't losing yourself. You were preserving yourself in the only way your system knew how. And the distance you feel now is not proof that you are broken. It's proof that part of you was strong enough to protect you before you even understood that you needed protection. Something begins to soften the moment you understand this. Not around you, inside you. Because for so long you've been fighting your own nervous system. You've been trying to force yourself to feel the way you used to, trying to become more present, more open, more alive, as if the distance was something you needed to break through, as if disconnection was a wall standing in your way. But what if it was never a wall? What if it was a shield? Not a shield designed to trap you. A shield designed to give you time. Time to carry what you couldn't carry all at once. Time to move through environments that required more from you than you could fully process in real time. Time to remain intact while parts of your internal world were under pressure. You weren't trapped behind it. You were protected by it. And protection changes how you relate to it, because you don't destroy protection. You understand it. You respect it. You stop treating it like an enemy. For years, you may have blamed yourself for the distance, blamed yourself for not feeling enough, blamed yourself for not being the person you used to be. You told yourself you needed to fix it, push through it, break it. But there was nothing to break. There was something to recognize, because your nervous system was never trying to disconnect you permanently. It was trying to regulate how much you carried. It was trying to keep your internal world within a range you could survive, even if survival came at the cost of full presence. And now for the first time, you can see it differently. You can see that disconnection wasn't abandonment. It was management. Management of overwhelm, management of pressure, management of emotional exposure in environments that didn't always allow space for vulnerability. Your nervous system didn't stop caring. It reduced access temporarily. It reduced access to protect your continuity, to protect your ability to keep going. This realization doesn't instantly restore connection. It restores something more important first. Trust. Trust in your own system. Trust that your body wasn't betraying you. Trust that your mind wasn't failing you. Trust that everything you experienced was part of an intelligent response to real conditions. You weren't weak. You weren't broken. You were adaptive. You were responsive. You were capable of adjusting in ways that allowed you to survive things you may not have been able to survive otherwise. And when you stop fighting your own adaptation, something inside you stops resisting itself. The internal tension begins to ease, not because everything changes instantly, but because the conflict ends. You're no longer at war with yourself. You're no longer trying to force something open that was never meant to be forced. You're no longer interpreting your protection as damage. You're seeing it for what it is, a response. A response that allowed you to remain here. A response that allowed you to continue. A response that kept you intact long enough to reach a point where you could finally understand it. This doesn't mean the distance disappears immediately. It means the distance stops feeling like an enemy. It stops feeling like evidence of your failure. It starts feeling like evidence of your endurance, because the version of you that exists now is not the version that was lost. It's the version that was protected. Protected long enough to eventually discover that what you thought was weakness was never weakness at all. It was survival. And survival is not the end of your story. It's the reason your story was able to continue at all. For a long time, you believed something in you had been lost, something essential, something you weren't sure how to recover. You looked at the distance inside yourself and assumed it meant you had become less alive, less open, less capable of feeling life the way you once did. But distance doesn't always mean loss. Sometimes distance means preservation. Preservation of parts of you that weren't safe to access yet. Preservation of sensitivity in environments that didn't know how to hold it. Preservation of depth in a world that rewards emotional efficiency. You didn't lose yourself. You placed parts of yourself somewhere safe, somewhere beyond the reach of overwhelm, somewhere beyond the reach of pressure that demanded constant output. And you stayed functional. You stayed consistent. You stayed reliable. But reliability came at the cost of full immersion. And you assumed that cost was permanent. You assumed this was the final version of you, the one that survives, but doesn't fully feel, the one that continues, but doesn't fully arrive. Until now. Because something changes when you understand why it happened. Not externally. Internally. You stop seeing yourself as damaged. You stop seeing yourself as incomplete. You stop seeing your disconnection as evidence that something went wrong. You start seeing it as evidence that something in you knew how to protect itself. Something in you knew how to survive. Something in you knew how to continue, even when continuing required distance. And this changes how you see yourself moving forward. Because if disconnection was protection, then protection implies something was worth protecting. Something inside you was never destroyed. It was never erased. It was never gone. It was waiting. Waiting for conditions where it no longer needed to hide. Waiting for a moment when survival wasn't the only priority. Waiting for a moment like this, where you could finally understand that what you experienced was never your failure. It was your adaptation. An adaptation means possibility. Possibility that the distance you feel is not permanent. Possibility that connection was never lost. Possibility that what feels absent was simply protected until now. Because protection doesn't erase who you are. It delays access. And when you begin to see it this way, you start noticing other things, other places where you adapted, other ways your nervous system protected you without asking for your permission, other patterns that shaped who you became, without you realizing they were shaping you at all. You start realizing that disconnection was never the only change. It was one of many quiet adjustments, many invisible decisions made by your system to keep you intact. Most people never see these patterns. They live inside them. They blame themselves for them. They try to fix themselves without understanding what actually happened. But now, you're beginning to see. You're beginning to see that what you thought was damage was protection. What you thought was weakness was intelligence. What you thought was the end of who you were may have been the beginning of someone you haven't fully met yet. Because this wasn't the only way modern life shaped you. It wasn't the only way you learned to distance yourself from parts of who you are. There are other patterns, other protections, other invisible adaptations still influencing you quietly, still shaping how you experience your life, still waiting to be understood. And once you see them, you can never unsee them. Not all at once, not all today, but gradually, in moments you didn't notice before, in ways that feel strangely familiar, in ways that make you realize you were never broken, you were becoming. And this was only one part of that story.